Welcome and thanks for tuning back in. This is Professor Jared Rathel. So, we're going to start our larger lesson on plant structure and function by initially honing in on the physiology of plant growth. So, on your screen are the truly special and spectacular baobab trees from Africa and Madagascar. They're definitely on my bucket list. So, the trunk diameters on these massive deciduous trees, which are really kind of like ecosystems unto themselves, the diameters can reach 36 feet across. These are giants. So trees, like the baobab, are going to make fruits to encourage animals like elephants to eat and move their seeds to new locations. Not only does this help expand the plant population, but it also prevents the seedlings from competing with their parents in the same space or suffering from pathogens that might be accumulating on their home turf. So seeds lucky enough to be eaten by a large animal, they drop into their new habitat encased in a big lump of nutrients. The feces includes things like nitrogen, which is often the limiting element for the growth of plants. For some species, passing through the digestive tract of an animal even increases the probability that those seeds are going to germinate. So male elephants looking for mates have been shown to disperse baobab seeds almost 40 miles from their parents. So studying the growth of large trees like these baobabs, as well as the giant conifers in southeast Alaska, have revealed surprising ways in which ecosystems, like those in Southeast Alaska, the temperate rainforests, are actually connected to distant oceans, and how different, seemingly different ecosystems can be very interdependent. Check it out.
This flower lives in a lush Alaskan meadow, but its survival depends on the deep ocean, hundreds of miles away. What could possibly bind the two together? These guys, chum salmon. As adults, they patrol the Pacific, gorging themselves and growing fat. But after a few years, the streams where they were born call to them. The salmon are hypnotized by the smell of the fresh water flowing from melting snow on the mountains above. By the thousands, they mob together and charge upstream. Eagles feast on the stampede of flesh. The salmon are relentless. They don't even eat, they just swim. They're reaching the end of their lives. But they have one last thing to do before they die. Females dig little nests in the gravel with their tails. Then they lay their eggs, which the males fertilize thoroughly. Then she covers them up. For most of these salmon, there's no hope of making it back to sea. It's the end for them. But wait, this story isn't done. One way or another, the salmon carcasses make their way up onto the riverbanks, into the forest. But bears are sloppy eaters. They take their favorite bits and leave the rest to decay. That's a score for these blowflies. They taste the flesh to make sure it's to their liking, but not because they're going to eat it. Their kids will call this carcass home. The fly eggs hatch into maggots that set to work devouring the salmon. Rotting flesh is their thing. When they've had their fill, the maggots squirm off and bury themselves underground until they're ready to emerge as adult flies. They scatter off to live their lives in the forest. When they die or get eaten, the nutrients from the salmon get spread throughout the ecosystem. Things like nitrogen that plants need to grow. So the river is like an artery, bringing an influx of vital nutrients direct from the deep ocean. In these coastal forests, up to 80% of the nitrogen in plants can be traced back to the salmon. And the blowflies have one more important job: pollinating fields of flowers. It's all thanks to these intrepid fish, who nourish an entire ecosystem, year after year.
So the tree rings on coniferous trees in those southeast Alaskan rainforests, like Sitka spruce, the width of those tree rings actually correlates to the size of the previous year's salmon run. So it gives dendrochronologists, biologists that study history by looking at tree rings, a window into the scale of how large some of these salmon runs actually used to be before we started damming rivers. So we're going to move on to fractals. A fractal is a geometric figure within which each part has the same statistical character as the whole. Computer-generated fractals are useful in modeling structures such as eroded coastlines, snowflakes, in things that have similar patterns that recur at smaller and smaller scales. They're also useful in describing chaotic, or at least partly chaotic phenomena such as crystal growth, even galaxy formation. And another beautiful computer-generated fractal. If we zoom in here, we can see smaller units. And as we scale up, we see the same pattern. We see this symmetry that occurs in fractals across larger and larger scales. And check out this final fractal. Computers are amazing, huh? Actually, this is Romanesco, a plant that exhibits a fractal form, repeated units that collectively demonstrate symmetry across larger scales. The DNA that's within the nuclei of plant cells is much like that computer code that generates fractals, in that plant growth follows a repetitive sequence of instructions. The growing shoot tip lays down stem, leaf, bud, stem, leaf, bud, ultimately producing Romanesco with its fractal morphology. And yet, when we look out our windows, we see that most plants aren't symmetrical. In fact, they're asymmetrical, like these pine trees growing in Scandinavia that are cultivated to produce jointless furniture. So the saplings are allowed to grow straight, upright, under full sun, and then they're partly shaded in order to induce this lateral growth. Then the shade cloth is removed and they grow upright again, and you're going to end up with a chair here that's all one solid piece. So, why is there asymmetry? This brings us to a fundamental difference between animals and plants with far-reaching physiological implications. When these Galapagos marine iguanas finish foraging for algae in the cold Pacific Ocean, they get up on land and they move to black volcanic rock to bask in the sun and warm up. They can move in order to thermoregulate. Plants can't just pull their roots up and move to acquire resources. Plants, unlike animals, have to alter their growth patterns, their forms, in order to move towards and acquire the resources, the sunlight, the water, the nitrogen that they need in order to complete their life cycles. So these are the exact same type of bean, same species. The seeds probably came from the same parent. But the bean on the right was grown with normal overhead light conditions. The plant on the left was grown with just a little bit of light that is being emitted from its left side. And you notice the discolored leaves, and then this plant is growing towards that light source. So this is known as phototropism. That's when the growth pattern of an organism, like plants or sometimes fungi, responds to a light stimulus. So phototropism is why those plants that you have in the window, once every couple of weeks, you got to give them a quarter turn. So plants are fundamentally different than most animals because they exhibit indeterminate growth. Plants continue to grow throughout their entire lives, responding to changing environmental conditions. There's only a handful of animals that I can think of that have indeterminate growth, the crocodilians and the lobsters. When I was born, like most animals, my genes had pretty much already determined what was going to be my ultimate height, just shy of 6 feet, despite what my driver's license says. Plants are capable of indeterminate growth because they possess apical meristems at the shoot and root tips, as well as in the axillary buds. These meristems house their stem cells. Stem cells are perpetually undifferentiated tissues that can be coaxed into growing into stem, root, or leaf cells. The elongation of the plant itself as it grows taller or as the stems expand is known as primary growth. This is driven by the meristems, the apical meristems, whereas the thickening of the plant, the widening of the plant, the annual rings laid down by the baobab tree, for example, this is secondary growth. So an observant biologist can determine primary growth that occurred this year on a stem by looking at the apical bud to the first bud scar. This represents growth that has occurred during this growing season. This bud scar to this bud scar represents last year's growth, and then further on down, growth of 2 years ago. So this is it's a little different here in the Sonoran Desert, right? We have the monsoon, the rainy and the dry season. This is more characteristic of temperate forests where things go dormant in the winter, and then you have a growing season from spring until fall. So lateral meristems are going to allow perennial plants, woody plants like trees and shrubs, to thicken, during this process called secondary growth. The vascular cambium is going to add layers of vascular tissue. So secondary xylem, that's xylem with an X, and we'll come back to this very important tissue. The xylem conducts water in plants. It also is going to lay down secondary phloem. The phloem pH, go with the phloem, carries the nutrients. So the phloem carries the glucose from the leaves to the respiring cells all throughout the tree. And we'll come back to the xylem and the phloem next lecture. And then we have the cork cambium. That's going to replace the epidermis with periderm. This is thicker, tougher stuff, creating a protective and in some trees, fire-resistant, what we call bark. So I would note that that phloem, that living phloem moving through the tree, that's very much living tissue, and it can be tapped into, as you see here in these maple trees in Vermont that are providing us maple syrup. And then finally, we used to see these all the time in Southeast Asia and Thailand when I lived there in tropical plantations. They grow rubber trees, and it's a similar process. They're tapping into the living phloem, and the trees are leaking latex, what we refine into our latex gloves. So note the arborist here doesn't completely ring the tree. So if you completely ring a tree, that actually will kill it, right? Because the phloem can't get to the roots. So in our next lecture, we're going to explore plant tissues, organs, and organ systems. Thanks for tuning in, and please do so again.